This is one I've waited a hell of a long time to talk about. Capcom and Sega had a really great thing going back in the mid to late 90s. The Sega Saturn was a huge success in Japan, and Capcom was making a mint off their arcade-perfect ports of classic titles like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and Street Fighter 03. It wasn't too surprising that Capcom announced a brand new and exclusive Resident Evil game for Sega's upcoming, well, at the time, Dreamcast hardware. Industry analysts consider this a huge coup for Sega, and it was marketed as the next evolution of the Resident Evil series. Sadly, we sort of all know how this story ends. Sega would exit the hardware business, and eventually Code Veronica would be ported to a whole bunch of different systems, and most recently, an HD re-release was released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. But I'm not here to talk about all of those. I'm here to talk about the original Dreamcast version. So, how does it hold up? Well, for the most part, incredibly well. The atmosphere still shines through. Code Veronica was the first entry in the Resident Evil series to go quote-unquote full 3D. Instead of using pre-rendered backgrounds, everything here is textured polygons, and remarkably, this game still looks incredible some 13 years after its original release. It's a little known fact, but Sega actually helped Capcom make the game a reality on the Dreamcast by aiding in the technical side of development. Code Veronica remains a moody, atmospheric, and chilling video game that everyone should experience at least once. From the fog and fire effects to the intricate details in the buildings and environments, everything feels much more alive than the original trilogy on the PlayStation 1. Character animations and zombie designs all look superb for such an old game. Coming off the original PlayStation, this really was an incredible sight to see, and remarkably, it still is to this very day. Something else that has aged really well are the cheap scares. They just never get old. Having not played Code Veronica in pretty much a decade, I was really surprised by just how many times the game made me jump. Sure, the scares are all like reactive, they're all the, jump out, boo type of stuff. But this isn't a game, that was trying to get in your head and terrorize you. And because of that, for whatever reason, it's aged perfectly. You will jump. It was also the introduction of somewhat logical puzzles. While emblems still remain, and there are some weird ones that'll make you scratch your head, there are also a lot of puzzles that just make sense, like the obstacle-based puzzles, where you need to move blocks to get to a certain area, or use a crane to move garbage out of the way, things like that. And compared to what had come before, this was leagues and leagues better. Speaking of what came before, the core gameplay remains pretty much exactly as you remember it from the original Resident Evil series on the original PlayStation. You solve puzzles, battle the undead, all while, trying to figure out what the hell's going on. You've got tons of weapons at your disposal. There's the first aid spray and the medical herbs. Basically, this is the Resident Evil you know and love, but it's been slightly evolved thanks to the power of the Dreamcast. Speaking of the power of the Dreamcast, not only are the graphics fantastic, but the audio presentation is also amazing. From classical pieces of music to eerie sounds of footsteps somewhere off in the distance, Code Veronica was masterfully created, and it really shows. It does a superb job of creating tension or building players' nerves up when they have to traverse a dark and foggy area. The game also features one of the most interesting Resident Evil storylines. Sure, it's goofy and it's illogical at times, but I thought it was, you know, enjoyable throughout the entire 15 to 20 hours. Basically, Claire Redfield, she's looking for her brother Chris, and along the way she gets incarcerated, finds out a lot about the history of the T-virus, and eventually players take on the role of Chris, and together the two of them basically unleash hell. It's actually much better than I remembered it. Now, something that will either make this review a 10 on 10 or a 1 on 10, completely depending on how you feel, are the infamous tank controls. I have no problem with them personally because I I started playing Resident Evil 1 on the original PlayStation and on the Sega Saturn, so I was used to it. However, I know a lot of people dislike the controls. But for me, the reason why they exist in the first place is because they make it so that you are never fully 100% in control of your character. And I really like that. The sense of fear and dread that comes over you when you see about 6 zombies is really unrivaled compared to any other game out there, just because you know, damn it, I don't have the responsive or tight controls to take out all of these other enemies. Something else that you'll either like or hate is the new camera system. Because this is the first fully 3D Resident Evil, the camera is much more dynamic, and I have no problem with that whatsoever, or the tons and tons of fixed cameras. You see, for the most part, the fixed camera angles are the way you're going to play 99% of the game. The dynamic aspect is simply because the camera now moves much more than it ever did before, if at all before. Now, the thing is, with fixed camera angles, there are a lot of times where zombies or other enemies will be just off the camera, so you can't see them. Sure, it gives you a couple of scares, but in terms of combat, it can be a little bit annoying when you just don't know how many enemies you've actually killed. And of course, there's the series' notable bad voice acting, and some of the goofy and annoying characters like Steve. In particular, oh, he's so uninspired and he's bloody annoying. But really, that's all there is to Resident Evil Code Veronica. It was a really big deal back in 2000, and it remains an extremely fun survival horror game all the way here in 2013. Sure, the tank controls might grate on your nerves, and the cheap scares will be old once you've experienced them for the first time, but it's the type of game that you'll want to return to in another decade from now, just to re-experience everything all over again. I was super impressed by just how much fun I had with the game, and it sort of made me sad to think of how far off the beaten path Capcom has taken the series today. If you're looking for something frightening to play this Halloween, Resident Evil Code Veronica is certainly a game worth digging out your Dreamcast for. For the full written review, hit up projectcoe.com.